There comes a moment when the person who has spent their whole life running from closeness suddenly finds themselves standing still. They don't understand why. They only know that something about you feels different, unsettling, yet safe. It's not the kind of connection they can rationalize or retreat from easily. It speaks to something older, something buried beneath the layers of self-protection they've built over years of emotional survival. When an avoidant meets someone who feels like the one, the first reaction is rarely joy. It's confusion, even fear. Because love to them is not an open field. It's a territory filled with echoes of loss and unmet needs. Yet beneath that fear is recognition, not of your face, but of your presence. A sense that you see through the spaces they usually hide behind. That quiet recognition begins to undo them. They start noticing subtle shifts within themselves. The urge to withdraw is still there, but it's no longer satisfying. Silence, once their shield, begins to feel heavy. They find themselves wanting to reach out, not because they've conquered their fear, but because you awaken a part of them that remembers what it's like to be known. This awakening doesn't happen through grand gestures. It unfolds in the smallest details, a longer conversation than usual, a glance that lingers, a truth shared after years of guardedness. The avoidant begins to test safety in slow, deliberate steps, and every step forward is a quiet act of trust. They won't tell you you're the one, not in words, but you'll feel it in how they start showing up differently. The person who once vanished in moments of intimacy now tries to stay, even if staying feels uncomfortable. The one who used to protect their solitude now invites you into it. In those moments, you are witnessing not just affection, but transformation. Because when an avoidant truly recognizes you as their person, something profound happens inside them. The self that was fragmented by fear begins to seek wholeness again. They start confronting their own patterns, not to please you, but because your presence makes them want to grow. They begin to understand that love is not a loss of control, but a return to balance, that closeness can exist without chaos, and that vulnerability can coexist with strength. They may never express this awakening in the language of romance, but in psychological truth, what's happening is far greater. It's the meeting of shadow and light, of fear and desire, of the wounded self discovering its capacity for connection. When an avoidant knows you're the one, they don't just fall in love, they begin to heal. When an avoidant person meets someone who truly reaches their inner core, a quiet transformation begins long before they even understand what is happening. Their emotional system, trained to retreat from closeness, suddenly encounters something it cannot categorize or defend against, a feeling of deep familiarity. This recognition isn't about surface attraction or shared interests. It's a subtle, almost spiritual resonance that feels like meeting someone who mirrors parts of their own soul. For someone used to emotional distance, this is both comforting and terrifying. They sense that this person sees them, not the version they perform for safety, but the truth beneath their guarded exterior. Avoidant individuals often move through relationships with an underlying fear of engulfment. The sense that being emotionally close will erase their independence or reopen wounds from earlier experiences of rejection or neglect. They learn to equate love with loss of control. So when they meet someone who reaches beyond those defenses, it challenges the entire framework that has kept them safe. Their instincts tell them to step back, but something deeper compels them to stay. They feel a kind of magnetic pull that makes no logical sense, and this paradox, attraction mixed with resistance, becomes the beginning of their awakening. This recognition beyond fear is not loud or dramatic. It happens in quiet moments. A shared silence that feels comfortable, a gaze that lingers a little too long, or a conversation that touches something they've never voiced before. These small interactions bypass their rational mind and speak directly to the subconscious. The avoidant senses that this connection is not threatening but revealing. They begin to see glimpses of themselves through the other person's understanding, an emotional reflection that feels unsettling yet strangely healing. What's profound about this stage is that it destabilizes the avoidant's usual strategies. The emotional walls they've built for years no longer feel as solid. Their habits of avoidance, withdrawing, intellectualizing, detaching, start to lose power in the presence of someone who feels emotionally safe yet authentic. This safety doesn't come from being coddled but from being accepted without pressure. The avoidant begins to experience a new form of intimacy, one that doesn't demand but invites. At a deeper level, this encounter touches something archetypal within them, the longing for union that exists beneath every defense. Even though their conscious mind resists, their unconscious recognizes that this connection could be transformative. They might not name it as love at first, but their body and emotions register it before their intellect does. This recognition brings both hope and unease, because it threatens the old identity that was built around self-protection. The part of them that once believed love was unsafe now faces evidence to the contrary. In this space of inner conflict, the avoidant begins to question what they truly want. They realize that the safety of solitude no longer feels fulfilling, and that real connection might require the risk of being seen. This is where recognition beyond fear begins to turn into growth, not through control or logic, but through the quiet power of emotional truth that refuses to be ignored. When an avoidant begins to sense that someone might truly matter to them, an internal storm quietly forms beneath their composed surface. The core of that storm is the conflict between safety and surrender. For most of their life, safety has meant control, keeping emotions measured, keeping people at a distance, keeping love predictable. Surrender, on the other hand, feels like stepping into uncertainty, where emotions are raw and unpredictable. When they meet someone who stirs something genuine inside them, these two forces collide. They crave closeness, but fear the vulnerability it demands. They long to connect, yet the very idea of depending on someone makes them feel exposed. This duality becomes a silent psychological war within them, one that shapes every interaction that follows. To the outside observer, this conflict may appear as inconsistency, warmth one day, withdrawal the next. But internally, the avoidant is fighting an old emotional program built to protect them from rejection and shame. They may have learned early that needing someone led to disappointment, or that showing emotion resulted in pain. Now, even when they feel genuine affection, the body remembers the past and interprets intimacy as danger. Their mind begins to overanalyze, looking for reasons to pull back. Maybe I'm not ready. Maybe they'll leave anyway. Or I need space to think. These are not lies, but protective instincts disguised as logic. Yet, when they meet someone who feels deeply significant, someone whose presence quiets their usual restlessness, that protective reasoning starts to lose its grip. They notice the tension between the person they've trained themselves to be and the part of them that wants to open up. Their emotional system becomes confused because for the first time, love doesn't come with pressure, it comes with understanding. That sense of emotional safety begins to challenge their old definition of security. They realize that maybe safety is not about walls, but about being with someone who doesn't threaten their freedom even when they're close. This realization doesn't erase the fear. It coexists with it. The avoidant moves between two worlds, one that urges them to stay hidden and another that whispers it's finally okay to be seen. They begin to test the balance between independence and intimacy, learning that they can care deeply without losing themselves. Sometimes they retreat just to make sure they still can. Other times, they surprise themselves by staying, even when their instinct tells them to run. Internally, this conflict feels like living between two truths, the comfort of solitude and the warmth of connection. Neither feels entirely safe, yet both feel necessary. The avoidant begins to understand that love is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to walk alongside it. In this tension, they start to evolve emotionally, realizing that surrender is not weakness, but the quiet courage to trust what once terrified them. The closer they move toward that realization, the more their fear begins to transform into longing, and their guarded heart begins to awaken to the possibility of real closeness. When an avoidant starts to realize that someone truly matters to them, love begins to act like a mirror rather than a comfort. It reflects back every defense, every fear, and every pattern they've built to keep intimacy at a distance. This is the stage where vulnerability begins to awaken, not because they decide to be open, but because the emotional connection itself makes avoidance impossible. What once felt safe, detachment, independence, emotional control, starts to feel hollow in the presence of someone who sees them clearly and accepts them anyway. For perhaps the first time, they feel the tension between who they've been and who they could be if they allowed themselves to feel fully. For avoidant individuals, vulnerability has long been associated with weakness or loss of power. Their emotional walls were built not out of arrogance, but out of survival, a way to manage a world that once made them feel unsafe to express need or pain. But when they meet someone who feels like home, that person begins to touch the places they've hidden even from themselves. Love, in this context, is not a soft emotion. It is a catalyst that exposes the truth. It makes the avoidant face parts of their inner world they've carefully avoided. The loneliness beneath their independence, the fear beneath their silence, and the longing behind their distance. As this inner confrontation unfolds, they begin to experience a strange emotional dissonance. They want to stay guarded, yet their defenses no longer bring peace. Their old coping strategies, pulling away, minimizing emotions, rationalizing feelings, start to feel unnatural. They find themselves thinking more about the person who stirs these emotions, wondering why their presence lingers even when they're apart. This is vulnerability awakening in its quietest form, not through confessions or grand gestures, but through an increasing inability to stay detached. At this stage, emotional intimacy becomes both terrifying and magnetic. The avoidant begins to sense that being open does not necessarily lead to rejection. Instead, it might lead to understanding. This realization is deeply unfamiliar. They may test it by sharing something small, a memory, a fear, or a truth they rarely reveal. Each moment of honesty feels like walking across thin ice, but when the ice doesn't break, a shift happens. Trust begins to form, not through words, but through emotional experience. What makes this stage so transformative is that the avoidant starts to recognize vulnerability as strength. They see that to love someone deeply requires not control, but surrender. Not in the sense of giving up power, but in allowing another person to truly know them. That awareness begins to reshape how they perceive connection. They realize that love doesn't threaten their identity, it expands it. In facing their fear of closeness, they start to reclaim the parts of themselves that fear had silenced. Love becomes less about protection and more about transformation, the slow, brave act of letting another person witness the self that was once hidden. When an avoidant realizes that someone is different, someone they can't easily detach from, their way of showing love changes in quiet, almost imperceptible ways. They don't confess it with words or sweeping emotion. Instead, their affection begins to appear through subtle actions that only someone truly attentive would notice. These are what could be called silent acts of trust. For an avoidant, Trust is not built through declarations. It's built through consistency, time, and safety. Every small gesture they make, every moment they choose to stay rather than withdraw, becomes a quiet rebellion against their own fear. Avoidants are deeply private people. They find comfort in distance, and it often feels unnatural for them to expose their inner world. But when they begin to trust someone, small cracks start to appear in their emotional armor. They may start replying to messages faster, engaging in longer conversations, or initiating contact themselves. They might reveal something about their past, not necessarily something dramatic, but something that matters to them. It could be a story, a regret, or an opinion they usually keep to themselves. These small disclosures are milestones. They're signs that the avoidant is slowly testing emotional safety and discovering that vulnerability doesn't always lead to harm. You can see it in their eyes, in the way they linger a moment longer before walking away, in the way they listen more attentively. These gestures may seem ordinary, but for them, they carry weight. The act of staying present, of letting another person in without retreating, is a profound expression of affection. They may still struggle with the instinct to pull back, but when they resist that instinct, it means something significant has shifted. Love, for them, becomes less about avoiding pain and more about daring to stay connected even when it feels uncomfortable. They also begin to show love through reliability. If an avoidant starts showing up, emotionally or physically, it's never casual. They may not articulate how they feel, but they demonstrate it through their actions. They remember small details you've mentioned, show up when you need help, or quietly take care of something that matters to you. These gestures replace verbal affirmations. They are their way of saying, "I care about you," without having to risk exposure. Their love language becomes one of presence, not loud, but consistent. At this stage, their walls are still there, but they begin to function differently. Instead of keeping everyone out, those walls become filters, allowing in what feels safe and meaningful. When an avoidant shares space, time, or emotion without needing to escape, it signals that they've found something rare, a connection that feels safe enough to challenge their old patterns. These silent acts of trust might go unnoticed by someone expecting overt affection, but to the avoidant, they are monumental steps toward connection. Every small gesture is a fragment of courage, a sign that fear no longer holds complete control. And though they may never express it openly, these quiet acts speak louder than any declaration of love they could ever make. When an avoidant person begins to truly trust and love someone, the relationship becomes more than just an emotional bond. It becomes a quiet process of transformation. Love begins to work like a mirror and a medicine, reflecting their fears while gently healing them. All their old patterns, the retreating, the self-protection, the emotional walls, start to lose their power as they encounter a new experience of connection that doesn't demand perfection, only honesty. What once felt impossible, being close without feeling trapped, starts to become a living reality. This is where love turns into alchemy. Fear begins to soften, distance becomes presence, and the avoidant starts to rediscover themselves through the relationship. The transformation is slow and often invisible to others. It doesn't look like a grand change, but rather a series of small inner shifts. The avoidant begins to notice how it feels to stay when things get uncomfortable. They start realizing that love does not have to mean losing autonomy or being consumed by another. The old narrative that connection equals loss starts to unravel. They find comfort in shared silence, in small acts of affection, in the safety of being understood without judgment. It's not that their fears vanish. It's that the relationship gives those fears a new meaning. Instead of being signals to run, they become reminders to grow. This stage of transformation also brings self-awareness. The avoidant begins to see how their old behaviors once served as protection, not rejection. They start to understand themselves with more compassion, recognizing that their fear of intimacy was born from a deeper need for safety. This realization marks the beginning of emotional integration, the moment when their inner child, once frightened of love, begins to trust that love can be steady and kind. Through this trust, they start to form a new understanding of connection, one based not on control, but on balance. In this space, both people in the relationship evolve. The avoidant learns to communicate more honestly, to stay during conflict, to let their emotions be seen without shame. They might still need space, but now it's not an escape. It's a way to recharge while staying connected. The person they love becomes a grounding presence, not someone who fills their emptiness, but someone who helps them face it with gentleness. In this process, independence and intimacy begin to coexist, creating a relationship that feels both free and safe. At its core, this transformation is about self-acceptance. When the avoidant realizes that love doesn't threaten their identity but deepens it, they start to open naturally. They become more patient, more present, and more emotionally responsive. What began as fear turns into understanding, and what once was distance becomes connection. The avoidant begins to live from a place of emotional wholeness, where love is no longer something to escape, but something that helps them discover who they truly are. When an avoidant knows you are the one, it's not a story of sudden transformation, it's a story of gradual awakening. Love doesn't melt their walls overnight. It teaches them that those walls were never meant to last forever. Through you, they begin to experience connection in a new language, one built on patience, presence, and truth. You become the mirror that shows them love isn't a trap, it's a path toward freedom. They start to discover that vulnerability is not the loss of strength, but the beginning of it. Each small gesture of trust, every moment they choose to stay instead of run, becomes a quiet step toward healing. In loving you, they don't just learn to connect with another person. They reconnect with themselves, with the parts they once silenced to survive. This is what truly happens when an avoidant finds the one. It's not a romantic fantasy. It's a psychological rebirth. The self that once hid behind distance begins to re-emerge, whole and human again. And in that transformation lies the purest expression of love. Not the pursuit of perfection, but the courage to be seen, to be known, and to finally belong without fear.